So Paul Hunt is a member of the community. He used to be my next door neighbor till I moved recently. He's got a wonderful dog and a wonderful wife, and they're great neighbors. And he also is a wonderful presenter on the history of water and sewer in Cape Elizabeth, something that started the whole town off as we exist today, and not having part of having South Portland as part of Cape Elizabeth as well. So he'll be able to talk a little bit about that. So Paul, would you like to give your talk?
Thank you all very much, both for inviting me to speak and then for so many of you coming out tonight. I've given the talk a few times before, but here I am in my town talking about my favorite organization. I've worked for public and private organizations in my life, about 5 or 6 of them, and the Portland Water District is by far my favorite because of what we do and the people who do it. And it just feels really important and great to be there and to be part of it, which I guess is why I last week celebrated my 25th anniversary. Like, I just reached the 25th year there. And I never thought that was going to happen, but here I am, which, by the way, is about 20% of the history of the entire organization since its inception, which I'm proud of. That sounds like a lot, but my good friend, the late Frank Meter, who was a Cape Elizabeth resident as well, he worked there for 49 years and 6 months. And when he retired, that was about 45% of the history of the organization. So, and he knew, by the way, he was beating like the previous most tenured member was like 49 years, and he knew I'm going to get to that, and he did. Really great friend. So anyway, the title of my talk is 1,200 Miles of Pipe, and it's about the history of water and wastewater in Greater Portland. And it's mostly about the whole system, which includes Cape Elizabeth, but is not only Cape Elizabeth. But Bob asked me, can you add some like Cape flavor to it? And so of course, that put me down the rabbit hole of back into the archives and what can I find? And I found a few things that I want to share with you. There's a natural break in the talk because I'm going to talk about drinking water first and wastewater second. And so I'll pause in the middle. And so if you want to hold your questions about water, about the first part of the talk until then I can answer those then, and then I'll do the wastewater part. And then, by the way, and if a water question comes to you during the wastewater talk, you can ask that one at the end too. So this is just how it's organized. And there's a reason to do drinking water first, and that's because it happened first. The drinking water history of the Portland Water District started 100 years before the wastewater history. So I'm going to talk water first. It's a longer story. I wouldn't say it's more interesting. Has some interesting elements, but fascinating how we as a community have dealt with wastewater treatment. And I have some information, particularly about Cape for wastewater treatment, but that began more like in the late 70s, the 1970s, whereas the water, you'll see, started really being a thing in the 1860s. So here, I'll talk about our water system. The water system that we all drink from when we're getting our water here in Cape Elizabeth originates at Sebago Lake. Raise your hand if you knew that your water is from Sebago Lake. That is so great because we are so fortunate. And by the time I'm done, if I do nothing else tonight, I want you to leave saying, wow, we have got the best water system. In fact, this is true. EPA was here 3 weeks ago to do an inspection, which is, they said, there's nothing wrong. We just do this periodically. Had been like 20 years since they had been here. And they spent a week, 4 people, 2 from Colorado, 2 from Massachusetts, asking a million questions, touring everything. And at the end, one of them said, I've been at EPA for 35 years. I've been all around the world. This is the best water system I've ever seen in the whole world. So that's not me talking, that's EPA. So I hope that I can convey that well enough so that you feel good about that when you leave. The history of drinking water in Greater Portland, if you go all the way back to the 1800s, there's a lot of, we have newspapers in our archives, and you can read the discussions that happened. By the way, it's amazing. If you ever read old newspapers, the debates they had, they're pages long, where people are conveying, this is my position on this, this is my position. And in the 1850s, Portland, and when I say Portland, I really mean the peninsula. That was really what Portland was. Deering was a separate community. And so really the conversations that you can read in the old 150-year-old newspapers were about the city of Portland had grown big enough on the peninsula that the water systems that they were using, which were really like rain barrels and cisterns. You might brick up an area in your basement and convey the water off your roof down a gutter, a spout into your basement and collect water there. And that's the water you used. By the 1840s, 1850s, it was clear that the population had grown enough that this was inadequate, that this was not a great way to provide water for a community of this size. But then just think about school conversations today. You can imagine this kicked off big conversations in the community, which it should, about what's the right size, what should we do, should we do anything? And so there's years of debate and discussion in the Portland newspapers in the 1840s, 1850s about, should we have a public water system? How should we do it? How would we pay for it? Anyway, on July 4th, 1866, the conversation ended. And it ended because Portland essentially burned to the ground. It was the largest city fire in the United States until the Great Chicago Fire, which was about 15 years later. But the city caught fire on July 4th. There was a story, I think it's apocryphal, that the fire department was on holiday. It was the 4th of July, that they were at Sebago Lake, enjoying the lake when the fire broke out. I've since read other accounts that said that isn't true. It is a great story, you have to admit it. I mean, it's so ironic, but this is a picture from the Maine Historical Society of what part of the city burned. And again, the city was the peninsula, and you can see it like gutted the whole peninsula. The fire started over there along the waterfront, according to contemporary accounts, someone playing with firecrackers caught fire, and then you can see which way the prevailing wind was, and it blew, from building to building to building, and there just wasn't enough water to put it out. The fire department, they would have to pull water from Casco Bay and then put it in those pumper trucks and try to put out the fire, and it was just moving too fast, so it burned all of that. This is what Congress Street looked like, that after the fire went out. You can just see, like, completely devastated the city. And look at this picture. I mean, every time I see this, I think of like Dresden after World War II. It just looks like, it's complete devastation. And again, the newspaper accounts of the time, which we have in our archives, 8 churches were destroyed. Well, I don't know why the number 8 comes up. 8 hotels were destroyed. Every newspaper, and look how many newspapers are listed there. Again, there was no podcasts, there was no TV, so newspapers is where you got your news, and there were a lot of them. All the newspaper offices burned down, all the banks, and then every lawyer's office in the city. I always get a chuckle when I tell that. My sister-in-law is a lawyer, and I don't know why it is, but everyone chuckles when they read that. But I mean, that's essentially everything, right? The whole city burned down. What that did is it ended the debate that had been going on for years and years about it's too expensive, we shouldn't do it, why should we do it, how would we pay for it? At this point, it was decided we need a public water system to fight fires in the city. And really, it was driven by fire, not by drinking water concerns, which is a common theme around the country, that the water systems were built to fight fires. Drinking water was almost an afterthought. One of the things that happened at that time is it was decided that the organization that would be legislatively chartered to provide drinking water to Greater Portland would be a for-profit water company, as opposed to what it is now, which is a quasi-municipal nonprofit water district. And there are still for-profit water companies in Maine and in the United States today. That's how it was organized in the late 1860s. So the legislature passed a bill that authorized this entity, the Portland Water Company, to build a water system for Greater Portland. Now, the first big question was, where are we going to get the water, right? What's the source of water going to be? And again, in the newspaper accounts, there were impassioned discussions about how best to do it and where to get the water. And the 3 big choices were Long Creek. I don't know if you know about Long Creek, very polluted now, but it runs right down through sort of where the main mall is. That was one of the choices, and that was very convenient. It wouldn't be much wouldn't take much effort to move water from there to the peninsula. That was one choice. A second choice was the Presumpscot River. Again, close, but there was concerns about water quality there. And then Sebago Lake was the kind of like the outside shot. Like no one really was serious about it until the city burned down. And then it was like, we're going to make sure we have plenty of water for all time. And I will just tell you that we should all be grateful that this is what everyone decided to do. So there's your water supply. That's what your water supply looks like from the air. First of all, isn't it the most beautiful water supply you can even imagine? And the idea was we want to make sure there's plenty of water for all time. So I'm going to tell you how much water is in Sebago Lake. So if you just took Sebago Lake and put a spigot on it and started draining it and filling, those splash trucks that are used to fill swimming pools. So if you started filling them, say each one could hold 10,000 gallons and is about 50 feet long, and you started filling them until Sebago Lake ran dry, how many trucks do you think you could fill? Before you'll never guess, but you could fill a lot of them. You could fill actually 100 million of them before Sebago Lake was dry. And that seems like a big number, right? But it still doesn't really help me that much. Like, I don't really know how much that is. I can't picture it, right? So what if you were to take all those trucks, 100 million of them, and line them up end to end? How far would it go? Now you can take a guess. How far do you think that line of trucks would travel?
The moon.
Okay, that is a great guess. It would water trucks filled with Sebago Lake water would extend from the Earth to the moon and back twice. So it's just an enormous quantity of water that they were right in 1866. If we get the water from Sebago Lake, we will never be needing water ever. And I will tell you that to this day, I'm going to tell you a little later about how much water is in reserve based on how much we use today. But if you ever pick up the newspaper, ever, and it says, Portland struggling with water quantity, just know Armageddon has happened, because there's just no way that should ever happen. In fact, what will happen long before that is you'll be reading Boston, Bangor, other cities looking to Sebago Lake for water. That will happen long before. So that's not something we just never had. You can lay awake and worry about other things, but you do not need to worry about the quantity of water in Sebago Lake. When you're next at Bissell Brothers or one of those trivia nights, and this is the best trivia question. When did water first flow from Sebago Lake into Greater Portland, and where did it go first? And here's the answer. It was Thanksgiving Day, 1869, and the first water tap was at 94 Danforth Street, which, by the way, there's still a building there, that the same building is still there. Don't know why they chose that tap to open first, but that's where it happened, was on 94 Danforth Street on Thanksgiving Day, which is, again, isn't that a beautiful like bow on the whole thing? Aren't we thankful? And by the way, we still, one of the great things about working for a company that's been around so long is you have these ancient records. You can go up into the attic and your wife will text you and say, when are you coming home? Because you get down there, it's like a rabbit hole and you just keep on finding things. And here is the first service card, these handwritten cards that tell you that this was a galvanized service, 3/4 inch, installed in 1869, 47 feet long. That's service number one. See the one up there in the corner. We still have that card. And there's the building as it looked long ago. That's how it looks today. It's still there. And that service has been renewed a number of times. Again, that's more detail than you want to know, but there it is, the first water service in Greater Portland. The first system that the Portland Water Company constructed, again, remember the fire was 1866 and the system started operating in 1869. So it took 3 years to build. Part of that system was these two open air reservoirs. Does anyone remember them? Has anyone been around long enough? Okay, so there was one, this one was at Bramhall, and they paved Paradise and put up a parking lot. The parking lot right at that, that triangular parking lot right outside of Maine Medical Center, that's where the reservoir was. Here it still was 50 years later in 1926. That's finished water, by the way. That's water when you're up in the tower of the old Maine Medical Center tower, looking down on it. And when you turned on your tap, it came from here. there had to be seagulls landing on that. Like, we just don't, that's why there are no open air reservoirs anymore. Everyone covers them now, but this is 100 years ago. And by the way, there was for the first 40, 50 years, there was no chlorine in the water either. It was just water. And there it was, open air like that. So there was one on Bramhall. Does anyone know where the other one was? The Munjoy Reservoir. And so this is the Munjoy Reservoir, this big earthen dam holding back, I think it was 3 or 4 million gallons of water. This next picture is better because it's from the air. You can see the B&M Baked Beans factory in the background over there. So that gives you a sense of where you are. So there's the Munjoy Reservoir. So the system, you know, the water was conveyed down from Sebago Lake. By the way, Sebago Lake's at 267 feet above sea level. We're at sea level, so it flows by gravity. Just think of what a great advantage that is. You don't have to push it uphill. Now, more recently, we've extended the water service up into Cumberland and into Windham and Standish, and we do have to pump that uphill. But the vast majority of the water in our system flows by gravity. We call it the gravity system, which flows downhill. And so the water would come down and then fill these reservoirs. When you turn on your tap, it came out of these reservoirs. And that's how the system operated into the mid part of last century. The Portland Water Company, I'm sure, did a fine job. I don't know, you know, there's not as many records about that as there are about the water district, but I'm only going to tell you a few things about it, and mostly they're kind of bad. This is how you got a water bill then. There were no meters in the system. You didn't have a water meter that measured how much water you used. They estimated. So they would come to your house apparently at some frequency and see how many sinks you had, what other ways you were using water, and then would bill you based on that. And you can see this is 6 months worth of water in 1888 for $20. And I found a little schedule of, I don't have a picture of it in here, but a schedule of rates. And it said like more than 3 horses, they would add like 10 cents or something. I always wonder, like, did you hide your horses, like bring them to your neighbor's house when the inspector was coming? So anyway, that's what a water bill looked like. And there were no water meters until much later. So as I said, I feel bad a little bit for the poor Portland Water Company, but the most infamous thing that ever happened was the Munjoy Reservoir burst. This was in 1893. And it's a tragic story. You can read about it if you Google it, because there was a man walking along the base of this earthen dam and he saw that it was leaking and it was getting worse. So he started running from home to warn people. And then while he was doing that, it burst and it rushed down and it washed away houses, including his house. And 3 of his family members were killed as he was running around telling other people to evacuate. And I was upstairs in the attic one night, missing dinner, and I found this ledger from the Portland Water Company that we still have, and, you know, blew the dust off it. And I found this entry in there where they paid $6,600 to the family for sort of damages, or, you know, to settle claims related to this terrible tragedy. And you can just see, it just wiped out all of these buildings down below. It was rebuilt and refilled and used again for many, many years. Okay, so that's the sort of the prehistory. I haven't even got to the Portland Water District. If you read the newspaper accounts around 1900, 01, 02, 03, there's a huge debate going on. There was a huge debate going on between advocates of continuing with a for-profit water company and others who said, water is really a community thing. It really shouldn't be a for-profit thing. Why would anyone be profiting on drinking water? It should be owned by the public. It should be managed by the public. And this debate went back and forth. And finally there was a vote in 1906. And this cartoon is just great because, first of all, there's the Portland Water Company down here, and it says Payson, who is the president of the water company. And he's not depicted very favorably here. He's holding a club that says $200,000 club with spikes on it. And the water company offered the city $200,000 to like call off the vote, and just like, and that wasn't appreciated by this cartoonist anyway. And he's wearing a crown that says Monopoly. Again, that was the argument, as a for-profit water company has a monopoly, and that's not fair, and we don't get treated well. And you can see there's like the working class coming across the ocean, the rising tide of socialism, and washing away the, you know, municipal ownership, washing away this private for-profit company. So again, this is the cartoonist view of what was being debated. The vote happened. It was about 3-1 in favor of replacing the water company with a water district. So once that happens, that's legally binding. The legislative charter was written up to say now this new entity, the Portland Water District, was going to take over. And then the new trustees were elected, and they approached the water company and said, okay, we'd like to study, see your books so we can see how much debt there is, and we want to inspect the system so we can determine its condition, so we can set a value, so we can pay you for all the assets that we're going to take over. And the Portland Water Company said, our books are sealed, make us an offer. So what do you think happened? So it was taken by eminent domain. All the works were put into receivership. A judge was given the responsibility of settling this dispute. Engineers and accountants were hired to sort of determine the value. Briefly, it was $4 million worth of assets, $3 million worth of debt. So about $1 million changed hands, and now the Portland Water District operated the whole system. And that took a year and a half or so to settle. The very first shop was on Kennebec Street, which is down kind of by Whole Foods, that part of town. That's where Kennebec Street is. Every time I go there, I look for, is the building still there? And I haven't figured out, is it one of the buildings that's still there? But you can see also that there were no motorized vehicles. In 1908, all of the pipe was moved around using these wagons. You can find the early, we have all the annual reports from 08, 09, 10, and they have things like oats and hay and harnesses. It was a blacksmith shop because that's how you moved the pipe around. If you look really closely, I zoomed in on that. It says Portland Water District. I wish we still had that. That'd be a cool thing to have. It doesn't exist anymore, but that shop was where we operated out of from 1910 until a few decades later. Here's a picture I found of a banquet, just, Portland Water District annual banquet from 1915. You can see we lacked diversity then. I'm proud to say about 30% of our employees are women now, and of course we're much better for it. But at the time, this was, water districts were very male. And they still are, but thankfully not as much as they were. But things are changing. Another irony, the water district was created because it was felt we needed to be able to fight a fire if it broke out. When the district took over and engineers evaluated what's the capacity of the system to move water, it turns out that the system could move about 10 million gallons in a day, and we used 9 million gallons as a community, meaning we didn't have millions of gallons in storage if we needed to fight a fire. So it really wasn't adequate. So one of the first big projects, which dominated the annual reports for several years, was not a new main, the new main. It's referred to as the new main is under construction. And this is a picture of the new main. It was finished in 1912. So it took almost 4 years to replace or actually augment the existing transmission main with this 42-inch cast iron main that went all the way from Sebago Lake all the way into around the Capissic Street. And that's like one of the main trunks of the system. And I say that because here's a picture of coming through Gorham. Looks like Vienna sausages. I love this picture with all the lengths of pipe that are being dropped into this trench. The new main, by the way, we call it the 42. And I say we call it because you're still drinking out of it. This water main is still in service. It's still in great condition when we have to work on it. We look at it still just as, one thing I'm very impressed with is how engineers over the years really looked long-term and built things to last. And, this main is, again, 112 years old, and we're still drinking out of it. It is not the biggest one, by the way. We now have the 48. By the way, another thing, I tease engineers because I'm a geologist, so I tease them all the time because I couldn't do the math, so I have to do something. So I make jokes, and one is like, couldn't you come up with more creative names? The 42, the 48, surely you could be more creative than that. And they all chuckle in their engineer way. In 1926, it was determined that Kennebec Street shop really wasn't big enough. We needed a bigger shop. We were growing. And this building was designed by, who do you think designed this? Surely you know. John Calvin Stevens, noted Portland architect, designed this building. We have these great interviews with him at the time where he talks about the fact that, in his opinion, municipal buildings should be both functional and beautiful. And his belief was functional, of course, because we had a duty to to serve the public, and they should be beautiful to show the public how much we care. And you know, I don't know about you, this is of course where my office is still to this day. This is still our building over on Douglas Street. You got to admit, that's a pretty beautiful municipal building. Like, it's very thoughtfully designed. If, by the way, if you look at it from the air, there's been additions put on it since then, but I think the original building was a W. And I wonder if it was for water. I can't find any reference to that, but it is beautiful. It has a slate roof. And a few years ago, about 7 or 8, there was an area leaking. It leaks a lot, by the way. A W is not a great idea, by the way, to make all these angles. And so we needed to replace some of the roof. And there was a discussion among our trustees, should we replace it with asphalt shingles? It's cheaper to do that. They won't last as long, but it would be cheaper. And in the end, the board decided, no, we have an obligation. This is a beautiful building. The slate roof has been here for 100 years. We should continue with slate. So we replaced this area with slate. Anyway, it's just a building that has served us now for almost 100 years. This is just a picture from inside. This part of the building is still there. If you drive down Douglas Street, you'll see that little arched window there. It was a garage then. Now it's a more of a blacksmith shop. It's a shop area. We don't keep the trucks inside anymore, but you can see we did back then. So here's some numbers for those of you who are engineers. The system we still do the same thing that the Portland Water Company was doing in the 1860s, convey water from Sebago Lake into Greater Portland for people to consume, but we just do more of it. And we have tools, and they're fancier tools, they're more computerized, but it's still the same essential function. And you can see we've kind of grown about 5 times. We had 11,000 services. A service is just a connection to the system. So your house is a service. And we had 11,000 or 12,000 of them. Now we have 62,000 connections to the system. Hydrants have increased by 5 or 6 times. And we now have over 1,000 miles of main. You might wonder, well, you said 1,200 miles of main in the title. Is because there's also sewer mains, but I haven't got to that yet. But anyway, the system has just grown incrementally over time as more and more people move into the area and want water. Now you would think then, if the system has grown 5 times and it continues to grow, that our use of water from Sebago Lake would just keep increasing kind of proportionally, right? I thought that. I think everyone would think that. And here's a graph showing you the average water consumption in million gallons per day every year from 1963 to 2023, so 60 years. If you notice, it's flat. So that's remarkable when you consider that we've gone from 30,000 services, this is back when I was born, essentially 1960, to 60,000 now. And yet we're consuming the same amount of water that we were back when I was born. Any thoughts as to how that could be? Okay, so I heard conservation. It's definitely true that we are much more, toilets used to flush with, I don't know how many gallons, but it's much less now. We've all learned how to tighten up the system. The system used to leak a lot. It's still, all water systems leak, by the way, but it's an effort that every water utility goes through now to try to eliminate what's called non-revenue water, which is water that we've produced, but no one's paying us for it because that's wasteful. And so we try to tighten the system. Another thing, by the way, is industrial uses. And industries are also being more efficient and not using as much water. So, or they're disappearing, like certain high water use industries, like Sappi used to have 7 paper machines, and now I think they have 1. If they still had 7, they're still one of our top customers, but they're not using nearly the amount of water they would if they had 7 paper making machines. So even though we've doubled in this time, number of services, we are using the same amount of water, which is good news. So here's the math: 22 million gallons a day, 365 days a year. Multiply those, you get 8 billion. So we drink 8 billion gallons every year, but there's more than 800 billion in Sebago Lake. So we have 100 years worth of water in reserve. Now, there are communities out west that probably have 6 months in their reservoir, or 2 years, or 5 years. We have more than 100 years. So as I say, if there's one thing you don't ever have to worry about, there's plenty of things to worry about in the world. Don't worry about the amount of water we have available. We have enough. So it's great to have lots of water. I mean, if you're going to establish a water system, make sure you choose a source that's plentiful enough that you won't run out. And we've done that. How clean is it though? Like you have lots of water and it's kind of dirty. Well, that's not as good. So how clean is Sebago Lake water? Well, I could go on for an hour. I mean, I'm the environmental manager, so this is what I do is water quality, but I'm not going to do that because you all want to go home. There's some TV show on at 9 o'clock that you probably want to watch. But how clean is Sebago Lake water? Well, there's a lot of ways to measure water quality of a lake, but one very simple one is just to measure its transparency. The more transparent it is, that means there's less crud, right? Crud means algae, soil, particles. You don't want a water supply that has lots of algae and has lots of soil particles. You want it to just be crystal clear. So one of the tests that lake managers use commonly is what's this thing? Does anyone know what this is? So this is a Secchi disc, which is just this black and white disc. You put it on a tape measure, you lower it into a lake, and you just record the depth at which you can't see it anymore. And so the bigger that number is, the more transparent the water is. So, and the great thing about transparency is it's so easy to do that lake managers all around the world do this. I mean, it's not much of an investment to buy one, and then you can test it as often as you want and see how, and lakes will vary over time, seasonally and year to year. So here is a chart of the transparency of 1,300 Maine lakes. So this is compiled by the Maine Lake Society, or Lake Stewards of Maine, I'm sorry. And again, you can just see like the height of the bar is the number of lakes that have this average transparency. So you can see most Maine lakes, it's 4 to 5 meters. So what's that, about say 20 feet, almost 20 feet, that you can still see that Secchi disc 20 feet down before then you can't see it anymore. Now, think about it, Maine lakes. Almost all of them, you'd love to have a camp on it, right? They're all beautiful lakes. They're high quality. They're transparent relative to other states, and most of them are here. You can see some lakes are more transparent than that, and some less. So where does Sebago Lake plot on this chart? Well, I wouldn't bring this all up unless it was in a good spot. Sebago Lake's average transparency over 40 years. We've been doing this every month for 40 years. It's 10.6 meters. Which is like 35 feet. And then that's the average. So since I've been there in 25 years, the highest number we got was like 15.4 meters, I think. That's like almost 50 feet. You can still see that disc. So Sebago Lake has very little stuff floating around in it. So think about it. We have 100 years worth of water, and it's so outstandingly clean. It's in the top 5% of all lakes in Maine. We're so fortunate. And this is why, again, the person from EPA said he thinks our water system is the best one in the world. Okay, so we do treat the water, but we didn't. The Portland Water Company did not provide any treatment. It was just pure Sebago water from the lake into Portland. From 1869 until 1914, if you turned on the tap in Greater Portland, you just got Sebago Lake water. But in 1914, you read the newspapers of the time, there was typhoid, there was cholera, people were dying. Like they had numbers on the front page of how many people died in the, since the last edition of the newspaper. It was never shown to be linked to drinking water. Milk was really the culprit that it seemed that's what the public health specialists of the time concluded. But you didn't really care that much in 1914. Like you wouldn't want to wait around for the debate. If you buried one of your children, you want something done. And so it was determined we should disinfect the water. We should add chlorine. So that began in 1914. From 1914 until 1939, there was chlorine added to the water. In 1939, it changed. And that was when the treatment was upgraded and we started chloraminating, which is chlorine plus ammonia. You add both of them, they combine together. It's a more powerful disinfectant. It has less taste and odor, and it lasts longer in the distribution system. So that's why we switched to that. Many communities now are switching to it now, but we were very early in doing that in 1939. And from 1939 until 94, that's what you got when you turned on the tap, is you got chlorine and ammonia as your disinfectant. In 94, the regulations changed. We learned that our system needed to be upgraded because the way this works is that there are what they call emerging contaminants. Like, so new things that we didn't know about are sort of found out about, learned about, and then regulations change and they say, what you're doing has been good so far, but you need to do more. And so in 94, we added ozone disinfectant to the system. So now the water is pulled from Sebago Lake, we ozonate it, and then we still add chlorine and ammonia to carry through the system. That's how it was from 94 to 2014. And then in 2014, we upgraded again for other emerging contaminants, in this case, cryptosporidium. By the way, we've never tested or we never found cryptosporidium in Sebago Lake, but the EPA regulations say you must treat as though it's there. Because if we waited, you might say, why would you upgrade and spend a lot of money to make your system more robust and to treat for something when you don't even have it in the source? Because if we wait around until it's in the source, you will drink it and you could die. I mean, some of them are waterborne diseases, can kill you. So systems were ordered to upgrade treatment further. So that's when we added ultraviolet disinfection. So now your water is disinfected 3 times before you get it. We ozonate it, we hit it with UV, and then we add chloramines at the end. This is just a graphic showing you how the system has grown from 1908 to present. So this is what this pink area is what our service area looked like when we took over the system from the Portland Water Company. These are the communities that we served. And now it looks like this. And so that green is the blob, is the amoeba, is more and more, you're building houses in Cumberland, you want to be part of our system. And so we extend up into that, and you can see how much we've grown. Remember, I mentioned the gravity part of the system, that's sort of all down here. This is all gravity, but then we have to pump uphill to get to these other places. I mentioned that we're still doing the same things that were done 100 years ago. We have better tools. This is, how many years ago is this? 40 years. That's not acceptable anymore, by the way, as a construction practice. They would be racing in there. There'd be other things done. But in 1983, that's what working on the Falmouth feeder looked like. This is the largest water pipe in our system. It's 60 inches in diameter. It's what we call the Rocky Tie Line. And so it's a pipe that connects. I mentioned that we no longer use the Bramhall Reservoir, which has been paved over, and the Munjoy Reservoir, which is gone. But now our major storage is at Rocky Hill and Methodist Road in Westbrook. And this is the pipe that connects those storage tanks to the transmission main so that when you turn on your tap, you get water from here. A big project we did in the 80s, we were getting some complaints about algae. So people in the late summer were turning on the tap and seeing green algae, and they were complaining about it. And so we looked into that, and what we learned is that our intakes, there are 2 of them that go into Sebago Lake that pull water from the bottom of the lake. They were in about 35 feet of water. Well, remember, I told you that the transparency of the lake is such that light can get all the way down even further than that. So you can get algae growing at that depth. And so in the late summer, we would be drawing in water that had algae in it. It doesn't mean it was harmful, but it wasn't very aesthetically pleasing. So we floated these extensions out there and attached them and ran them out deeper into the lake. And so now we draw our water from 85 feet of water, not 35 feet of water. And we haven't had an algae complaint in 40 years. This is an aerial image of the Rocky reservoirs, Rocky Senior and Rocky Junior. Again, engineers named them, so they're not that creative. Each one holds about 9 million gallons. So that's 18 million gallons of water, and we use 22 in a day. So that's just a little bit less than a day's worth of water. That's how much water we consume every day. I mentioned that we chlorinated from 1914 to 1939. And then in 1939, we got a federal money through the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, to hire people, to put them to work. And they rebuilt our chlorine building and built this one in 1939, which we used until 94 when we abandoned it and built the bigger one. And one of the coolest things that we discovered, I didn't find it, I wish I did, but someone about 10 years ago went up here in the attic and they found this plaque that says Portland Water District, Chlorine Building Project, 1939, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I don't know, just to me, that was just felt so cool. So the shop polished it all up and now it hangs in our Douglas Street building. I mentioned that we had to upgrade treatment, that chloramination system was no longer adequate under the new regulations. So we built the ozone treatment facility. This is it under construction, a lot of rebar. As you can see, this was in the early 90s. This is a little bit closer to being done. And then this is what it looks like today. It's been, I told you we added ultraviolet disinfection in 2014. That occurs out here. So we have ozone here, ultraviolet, and then the chloramines are added there. So that's how your water is treated today. And so the last thing I'm going to share with you, I looked and looked for something very unique, Cape Elizabeth in the history of the water system. Really didn't find anything that stands out, which is good. You don't want exciting water, right? If there's any good stories are usually bad stories. But I did want to share one thing with you, which is history about to be made. And that is that this transmission main, you see the light blue line here that's highlighted? That's a 1949, 1950 transmission main. It's 30 inches in diameter. And it was put in, you can see that there was a submarine water main that came across from Portland to South Portland and then down into Cape through Cache Point. That's how Cape got its water until 1949. And that failed and had to be removed. In fact, it says the engineers ordered the district to remove it from Portland Harbor. So we had to remove that pipe, and then we replaced it with this one in 1949, 1950. So it started, but notice this right here. In Cape Elizabeth, we had to have water conservation that year because we just didn't have enough water. You have to have a big enough transmission main to meet the needs of the population. So this main was put in to solve that problem. So it's been there now for 70 years. So one thing you don't want to, okay, if you have a car like I do, and mine's not that new, I'll drive it till it breaks down, and then I'll call Pat and she'll pick me up, and for a few days she'll drive me to work, and then I'll get the car fixed, and then we're back in business. But you can't really do that with a water transmission main, or it's very unwise, because if this thing fails, we might be out of water for a couple of weeks, could be months, who knows? So one thing you want to do is you want to kind of be proactive, and you want to make sure you don't use things until they fail. And so what we're doing in this month, and you might read about this in the paper, I'm not sure, is we're going to inspect this main and see how, should we replace sections of it? Should we do something, or is it okay? And so, oh, by the way, this is a picture of what it looked like being installed. So this is 30-inch reinforced concrete pipe. Again, it's been there for 70 years. So what we're going to do, and we've never done this before, is we're going to inspect it while it still stays in service, because otherwise we would all have to go without water for some period of time. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to put first what's called a pipe diver through there. And so we'll be using the water. This will be disinfected, and then it'll be put in the main, and it will run along that whole length of main. And what it does is it is able to determine, like this concrete pipe has wire all the way through it, and it can detect if the wire is broken. And so that's like the beginnings of the deterioration of the pipe. It can see that. And so we'll get a report about that with the pipe diver will tell us. And then the second thing we're going to do is run this thing called a smart ball through, which again has electronics in it, and it can detect leaks. It can hear leaks. And so if it hears it, it'll tell us exactly where it's leaking underground. So then we can go and dig that spot and fix the leak. So we haven't done this before. It's going to happen, I think, starting September 30th, that first week of October. So hopefully nothing happens and there's no big story. There might be some traffic disruption, but that's something that's going to be happening in a few weeks. That is the end of the water part of my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have some. I think I saw your hand first.
Where's the intake? It's Sebago, and is there any redundancy built in the system?
Okay, you must work in the water industry. Redundancy is probably the most important thing, because again, I can live without my car for a week. I'll be irritated. I'll be irritable, right? I'll say, oh, I hate having to wait for Uber or whatever, but it's no big deal. I'll still get to work. But if we're without a water main for a while, everybody's life is a shambles. And so you never want to rely on one thing. So if you need 2 pumps to do something, then you want to have at least 3, if not 4. And our system is built with redundancy all over the place, including the intakes into Sebago Lake. We have 2 of them named by engineers. So there's the 25 intake and the 52 intake. So you know when they were constructed. And they're both in 85 feet of water, and we can switch back and forth. We can draw water in both of them at the same time, or we can switch from one to the other. And like I say, everything in that treatment plant, we have 4 raw water pumps. We could really use just one, but we have 4 of them. So we just have double everything. which can feel like overkill until you need it. And then you're so glad that you have that other pump. So yes, we have two intakes and they're both in the lower bay of Sebago Lake. So if you go, if you go to Sebago Lake, go through Gorham, you see Beal's Ice Cream, and then you turn right, you go down 237, do you know where I'm talking about? 237 goes all the way to Sebago Lake, and right at the end of it, that's where the 25 intake is. You'll see it right there. I should have a picture of it, but that's the 25 intake, and the 52 is just across the cove, and they both go out into the lower bay of the lake, so the very southern end of Sebago Lake. And there, you'll know that if you have a boat on the lake, because there's a no body contact zone that was established by the legislature 100 years ago. So you can have a boat in there, but you can't swim.
That picture that you had showing the plant and the lake behind it, are the intakes in that?
Yes, right in that lower bay of the lake. So it's right, the southern end of the lake is all in Standish. And the land we own is all around in Standish, all around, I call it the green collar around the southern end of the lake, and that's where the intakes are.
There's a pink residue that we see.
It has a terrible name, pink slime. I know it sounds gross. It's a waterborne, it's an airborne bacteria. It's not our system, it's not our water, it's just, because you can find it, we have an employee who lives in Raymond, has a well, and he gets pink slime in his dog's dish, and you can see it in the toilet sometimes and around the drain and it just means the water has been stagnant there, it's in, in humid weather, and this bacteria in the air can populate that, and so you just use an ammonia-based cleaner and it'll clean it up.
It's easy to get rid of.
It's not harmful and it's not from our water, but our water harbors it if the water's not draining well, and so that's what that is. Okay, great question. Okay. She asked, why don't we filter the water? There are 13,000 public water supplies in the country that use either a lake or a river for source. The rest use groundwater. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm just going to talk about surface water systems. There are 13,000 of them. Only about 50 are exempt from filtration, and we're one of them. So we have a legal document that says you do not have to filter this water. You have to disinfect it, which is one reason why we have 3 disinfectants, but you do not have to filter it. And it's because there's essentially nothing to filter out. If we built a filtrate, our turbidity, okay, so turbidity is a measure of how much crud is in the water. Crud is the technical term for it. But the number that you look for is 5 turbidity units. And don't worry about what the units are. I'll just tell you that if I gave you a glass of water that was 5 NTU, you would drink it because it doesn't look, you'd have to get up to like 30 or 50 or 100 NTU, and then you'd be like, that's mud, I wouldn't drink that. But at 5, your eye can't detect it, but an instrument can, and that's the limit that you want your finished water to be under 5. Sebago Lake untreated is 0.22, 0.24, 0.26. It's less than 1/10 of the standard, and it never varies. We never have seen, in my 25 years, we measure it continuously 24 hours a day, and it's never been above 0.4 ever. So there's nothing to filter. And by the way, we should all be thankful, because our estimate is if we ever have to build filtration to treat Sebago Lake water, today it would cost probably $500 million to build that plant, and then you'd have to operate it, which would be millions every year, plus chemicals, plus electricity. We don't ever want to do that. And so, and by the way, if we ever got to that, not only would we be spending a lot more for water, because we're a nonprofit. The money would come from all of us, right? It wouldn't come from anybody but us. So we'd be paying more, and we'd have a dirtier lake. So all the benefits of Sebago Lake, just as a natural resource, would be diminished too. So our goal is that we will never have to filter Sebago Lake. And we're, again, so fortunate.
Are there boats on that lake?
There are
And
boats.
don't they affect the water?
So that's a great question. This is probably the most common question that I get, which is, why can you have a boat? First of all, 90% of the lake is completely unrestricted. You can swim in it, you can boat in it, you can fish in it, just as you could in any lake. But the lower bay, where the intakes are, has a no body contact zone 2 miles from the intakes, and then it has a no trespassing zone 3,000 feet from the intakes. So you can have no boats in the sort of the center of the bullseye, and you can have a boat outside of that, but inside 2 miles, but you can't swim, you can't touch the water. And so people will say, well, wait a second, a boat is more polluting than a swimmer. Why do you allow boats but not swimming? Well, first of all, we don't allow anything. This is the legislature that established these no body contact, no trespassing zones 100 years ago. And the fact is that if there was ever enough gasoline, you know, because a boat leaves a gasoline residue, but remember, gasoline floats and it wants to be in the atmosphere more than it wants to be in the water. So if there was ever enough gasoline in the water that it could make you sick, you'd never drink it because you'd be like, whoa, what is wrong? You would know it immediately. So you're really, and we've never detected gasoline in the water because we're drawing it off the bottom of the lake. And again, it wants to volatilize and go into the atmosphere. Whereas swimmers, if you've had a lot of people swimming, I hate to say this, but we shed viruses and bacteria and pathogens, which if they get drawn in, now hopefully we would disinfect them with our 3 disinfectants, but if they ever got through that, we could die because you could drink it and then it could grow in your body and kill you. So human body contact is a much more concerning thing. Again, it would be better if there were no boats there, but the lake is big enough, we've learned, that it can handle some boating and still be still be the best water supply in the world, according to EPA.
To what do you attribute Sebago Lake's clarity, transparency? Because like, when we go to Ossipee, Audubon, it's, you know, it's okay, but Sebago Lake, why is that such a clean lake?
I promise I didn't plant him. That is just a great question. And I will just answer this. Nature and nurture, it's both. So Sebago Lake is incredibly deep. It's more than 300 feet deep at its deepest point. Remember, it's at 267 feet above sea level. So the bottom of Sebago Lake is lower than sea level. And so it's this enormous body of water. It's cold because this is Maine. It's cold, it's deep, and it's surrounded by a watershed, the area that drains into the lake, that's almost all forested. Where we are, Greater Portland does not drain into Sebago Lake. Where, you know, Greater Portland drains into Casco Bay. The area that drains into Sebago Lake is Naples, Bethel, Harrison, all rural communities that are of 85% is wooded. And so all those forests, that is our filtration plant. That's how come we're saving $500 million, is because the trees treat our water for us while we sleep. And so one of the things the district has been doing for the last 25 years is working with land trusts in the watershed, helping them, because what do land trusts do? They conserve land, like Robinson Woods, right? And other places. That's what land trusts do. The water district is partnering with land trusts and others like the Nature Conservancy to help conserve those forests. Then think about it. Not only do we not have to buy the filtration plant for $500 million, but you can hike on that filtration plant, the natural filtration plant that exists. So the reason why Sebago Lake is so clean is that, first of all, it's just an ideal water supply. Its depth and its size and its location. It's also been so well cared for because all the woods are still intact. And our goal is that they will always be intact.
And the trees' roots are the ones that those right going.
Yeah, that's it. I love this question too, and I'm so glad you're here. Think about when you walk through the woods, because people do say, like, how do trees treat water? Think about when you're walking through the woods and it's raining. You're walking through, and what do you hear? It sounds like drumming, right? It's like, what's happening is these water droplets are falling from the sky, from the clouds, and they're coming down a mile, 2 miles. That's a lot of energy that's being directed right at the earth. But the canopy, the tree canopy, is stopping it. And that's what you're hearing. That sound is the energy being dissipated before it ever hits the soil. So the tree is stopping all that energy, and then the water kind of drips down the tree and then hits the ground gently. So that's great. And then what's on the ground? Pine needles, leaves. It's not flat and smooth. It's hummocky. It's got indentation. So the water ponds up and it seeps into the ground. And then so the roots of the trees can do what they do. So those trees naturally treat our water every day while we sleep for free. So all we have to do is keep them intact, and we will never have to filter the water, and we can hike on that land. So that's what we hope can happen over the next 100 years. And we've been working on it now for 25 years. And collectively, the district and the land trusts and others, partners, have conserved 16,000 acres of forest in that 25 years. So Sebago Lake, like any lake, varies in how deep it is, I guess, based on rainfall. So there are years when there's not a lot of rainfall and the lake level can drop as much as 5 or 6 or 8 feet. In the 40s, by the way, there was a 10-year drought in Maine, and Sebago Lake water did drop so that the highest level in those years was lower than the lowest level it gets to now. So the lake dropped about 10 feet or so. And then, of course, Maine caught fire. You might have read about that in 1947 and burned thousands and thousands of acres. So the lake does vary in level year to year naturally, just because there's rainier years and there's drier years.
Is fluoride added to the water?
Fluoride is added. We get this question, I get a question about it periodically because you'll read stories about fluoride and there are advocates for and against it. The American Dental Association, the American Medical Association are strong advocates of community fluoridation. Other people say, well, it could have, what about health effects that could exist? And I'll just tell you, I'm a geologist. I'm not going to question the American Dental Association, the American Medical Association. I will trust them that having fluoride in water is a good community health measure. In fact, the Center for Disease Control calls fluoridation one of the 10 greatest health advances of the last century. But you do read stories periodically about, what about, are there adverse health effects? What I will say is that the Portland Water District has been adding fluoride since '96 because you voted for it. That's the way it works in Maine, is if the community votes for fluoride, a water utility must add it. If a community votes to have it removed, then we must stop. And so we've been fluoridating since '96.
If you drop the level, because it started at 1.2.
Yes, you've been reading, right? We follow whatever the guidelines are. So from '96 until around 2014 or 15, we were told fluoridate at about 1 part per million, maybe it's 1.2, and then we were told 0.7 is a better number. So now that's our target. And it's one thing that's good about like chlorine. When you add chlorine to water, it dissipates over time. So the concentration here is different than the concentration here, whereas fluoride is the same concentration throughout the system. So once you lock it in at 0.7, that's pretty much what you get. I'll do 2 more questions, and then I think I'm going to do the wastewater part because you probably want to go home.
Did Portland Water District play any part in the separation of Cape Elizabeth and South Portland?
Not to my knowledge, that we're just about water and wastewater. We don't, that would be a political thing that would be between the communities. We do often get questions about, I've advocated, it hasn't ever gone anywhere, that Portland Water District isn't a great name for us. We really should be the Greater Portland Water and Wastewater Utility District, but it doesn't really roll off the tongue. But we are legislatively chartered to treat water and wastewater, and so that's what we do.
The engineers could rename it.
One last question, and then I'll finish the talk.
We're so worried these days about another 9/11. How safe is the water supply from sabotage or?
So the way I would answer that is that before I was working at the Water District in 2001. And I would say the tenor of all water utilities before 2001 was tell people about our system, invite them in, show them how it works, because it's your system, it's not our system. We just operate it for the public. And we still do tours, but we would tell you anything. We would hand out maps showing you all of our distribution system and everything. After that, EPA said, the federal government said, you all have to be a little more careful with your information. You have to lock down your systems. We have computer systems to operate the system. It's very hard to get into them. You'll read about in the paper that's been tried and is probably being tried now. But I would just say that it's now like a core part of what we do is we assess the vulnerability of our system periodically, both from physical and other types of threats. And then we try to, identify what's the most risky things and protect against them. Can you ever be 100% protected? I don't know how to answer that, but I will say that it's what we talk about all the time. And we have to, we're legally obligated to do it, but it makes sense. And we did have vulnerabilities that you didn't really think about because you weren't really thinking about that anyone would ever do such a thing. Okay, I'm going to move on to wastewater just so you can get home at a reasonable hour. I have a lot of Portland East End wastewater treatment facility pictures and things. Just because that's kind of the biggest part, that's the biggest facility that we have, and it's the talk I've given a number of times in Portland. And so I have a lot of pictures of that, but then I want you to know I found a lot of CAPE information that's at the end. So I'm just going to get to that. The history of wastewater treatment in the United States really began kind of in the same way that water did, which is communities, there was no legal requirements that you treat wastewater in the 1950s and the 1960s. There might have been local ordinances, there might have been even some state regulations that said you communities need to do certain things, but there was no federal law that set any standard that applied around the country. And so in 1954, this is a picture of East End Beach in 1954. It was like Coney Island. It was very popular, it was very crowded. And it was around this time that water testing was showing that, boy, the water is not safe. There's a lot of bacteria here. It's unsafe. And so in the 50s, late 50s, the city of Portland closed East End Beach and said it is just not safe for the public to swim there. And through the 60s, you could not swim there. One of the reasons why, well, the reason why is that this was wastewater treatment this was the standard. This was the industry standard. You conveyed water from your homes and got it as quickly as you could to the nearest water body, whether that's Casco Bay, the Presumpscot River. This is how you got rid of wastewater. So this pipe, by the way, is still there on Willard Beach, but now it just has stormwater, which, by the way, stormwater, you may not want to swim in that all the time either. But when this picture was taken in 67, if you flushed the toilet in that cottage, it came out that pipe and people were swimming here. And so this is what led to, in the late 60s, early 70s, this became a thing where it was, some of you may remember, this is what everyone was talking about. What are we going to do? And we were fortunate that Ed Muskie was a champion for the country of championing this issue, that waters of the United States should be fishable and swimmable. That's the principle. That's the Clean Water Act. It passed in 1972. This is Ed Muskie with some of his aides talking about this, but it finally did pass in 72. Now, there was some wastewater treatment going on at the time, but this sort of set a bar that now all communities had to aim for this bar and try to get over this bar. It also provided federal money, which was often the obstacle, as it often is, right? A community wants to do the right thing, but wow, look at that cost. There was federal money allocated, and communities all around the country started building wastewater treatment plants. So now I'll fast forward to today. By the way, at that time, it didn't say how you had to do it. And so some communities did it themselves. But what happened in the early 70s is the water district approached all the communities that we provided drinking water to. And we said, hey, we're not legally authorized to do wastewater treatment, but we will if you want us to. And so not all 11 of our communities said yes, but a bunch of them did, including Cape Elizabeth, and said, yes, we would like you to be our regional wastewater provider. And then we went to the legislature and our charter was changed to add, before that it said drinking water only, now it says drinking water and wastewater. And interesting thing about it is that some communities said, we want you to do everything. We want you to manage the sewers, we want you to treat the water. Others said, we'll manage the sewers, you just do the treatment. And others said, we don't need you at all, we'll do it ourselves. So there's a whole mix, but we now have 4 treatment facilities and a 5th one is under construction in North Windham. We have about 200 miles of sewer mains. There's a lot more than that, but communities are often managing their sewers, and we just manage what's called the interceptor, which is the big main that collects all the water from the sewers and brings it to the treatment plant. So we have about 200 miles of that. We have about 70 sewer lift stations. You know what sewer lift stations are. You see them all the time, but you probably don't think much about them. So here they are. So I'm going to show you. Well, first of all, here are our treatment plants. There's one on Peaks Island. It's award-winning because it was made to blend in with the community, so it didn't look like a treatment plant. That's our smallest one. There's our Cape treatment plant that you know and love on Spurwink. There's our Westbrook treatment plant. So I'm getting larger. This is the second largest one. And then there's the big Kahuna, the East End treatment plant, which is the largest one in the state of Maine. So, and I say we're constructing a 5th one. The work of sewering all these communities and treating their wastewater in one of these 4 facilities really involved a lot of underground infrastructure that you don't ever see, but that was probably the harder part. One thing to construct a plant like that, at least you can kind of fence off the area and do it. But how about all going underneath all the roads? Well, things are happening, like Commercial Street in the Old Port. Imagine sewering that, but it happened. So there's a lot of underground facilities like this vault. That's our largest sewer main. It's 72 inches in diameter. So this is like a street coming down here, and it's intercepting. This used to go right into Back Cove. And now this vault, it collects in this vault and then goes in this big main toward the treatment plant so we can treat it. By the way, you might have noticed a construction project next to Back Cove that's been going on seemingly forever. That's the city of Portland, but we're partners, so they've had some challenges building that. But what that is, it's basically a big basement to flood. What I mean by that is when you build a sewer system that's combined, Portland system is a combined system, meaning it has sanitary wastewater from our homes, plus it has stormwater off the streets. So under normal conditions, you're flushing the toilet, you've got washing machine water and dishwasher water. The system can handle all of that and bring it all to the treatment plant. Then it starts raining. And what happens is it overwhelms the capacity of the system, and then it starts overflowing. There's 70 locations around that are called CSOs, combined sewer overflows, and they dump over untreated wastewater into Casco Bay. So what the city is doing is building these huge reservoirs, underground concrete reservoirs to flood, so that instead of spilling over into Back Cove, it'll fill this big vault, and hopefully it'll stop raining before the vault is full, and then you can bleed that back into the system over time. They've just had that particular one has been going on. They've had a couple of problems with the construction, but I wanted to mention that because people ask me all the time, what are they building? And it's basically a basement to flood. There's already a couple of them, and that's, I think, the third or fourth one. So this is what sewer lift stations look like. They all look a little different, like snowflakes, but what they're doing is they're just, wastewater treatment is really about gathering water from all of our homes and getting it over the topography to wherever the treatment plant is. And it's getting it over the topography that's kind of the work, because, the water might flow to here, but then you got to get it over this hill to here and to here. And so these lift stations do that. So they're just like, this is in Shipwreck Cove, this is just basically a catch basin. And so it fills up slowly, and then it reaches a certain point that clicks a pump on and it pushes it to the next lift station. And so, that one is on India Street. Next time you're in the old port, go up India Street. Doesn't look like much, but that thing is like 60 feet deep. That's the biggest one in our system. This one is on Spurwink. You've seen that one, right? You see that every time you go to the dump. And then that one's on Shipwreck Cove. This one's my personal favorite because it's like this brutalist art brutalist art project on Little John. And then this one is on Ottawa Road. Anyway, all they're doing is gathering wastewater from our homes and then moving it to the next spot until it gets to the treatment plant. This was when East End was built. First thing we had to do is excavate a dump that was there. So this is a picture of, this is an old picture I found of the beginnings of that project. Then we have the engineer looking out over his dominion here of all the rebar and concrete. By the way, I worked for the district for about 5 years in the laboratory. And then someone said, have you ever been downstairs? And I really had never been down in the treatment works. You go down, it's like an airplane hangar. It's so big, and it's like my mind was blown because I just never thought that so much was underground. But once I saw it, I thought, of course you do that. You don't want to have to dig a hole every time you need to change the oil in a pump. You want all that stuff exposed. So there's this huge area underground with all of our infrastructure. A lot of rebar. This is one of our clarifiers. Those things that look like flying saucers from Tukey's Bridge. That's our clarifiers. Again, here's we're getting closer to the place being ready to open. For the first couple of years, those flying saucers didn't exist. It was open air, but that didn't smell that good, and we got complaints. So we covered the clarifiers. So all that happens, by the way, and all treatment plants are kind of doing the same thing. Settling occurs in the first basin, aeration here where you bubble air into it so that bugs can eat the organic matter, and then you clarify it or settle it out, and then you disinfect it and it goes into Casco Bay. Good news is it worked. That once that plant had been operating for a few years, water tests showed you could swim at East End Beach again. It still gets closed periodically, but the type of bacteria that you can measure there after a rainstorm it indicates that it's not coming from the treatment plant, it's washing off the streets. And that's what's causing periodic water quality issues that cause the city to either post the beach warning or close it. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you about Cape's wastewater history because it's actually way more interesting than I ever knew. I've worked here for 25 years and I never knew the backstory. But this is a picture of Cape Elizabeth, and the sewer systems colored two different ways because they are separate. You notice they don't connect. Did you know this, by the way, that there's Cape North and Cape South? Well, now you're going to know. That's called Cape North. Now we call that Cape North, and we call this Cape South, and they are not connected. So if you live in the Cape North area, which I do, our wastewater does not get treated at that Spurwink wastewater treatment facility. It gets treated, guess where? In South Portland, just below the Casco Bay Bridge. And you might say, why would you do that? We're Cape, it's Cape Elizabeth. Why don't we have our own treatment plant? It's really just about geography and hydraulics. Like it made more sense to send the water that way. So we pay South Portland to treat the wastewater from the Cape North system. So that's where the treatment plant is there. And then in the Cape South, the treatment plant is there at Spurwink. And by the way, isn't it a little bit odd, by the way, that in Cape South, the treatment plant is way up here, but it discharges into Peebles Cove? I wonder why that is. I probably should cover that. Another thing that's interesting is that the Cape North system started operating in 1975, but the Cape South system did not start operating until 1987. I'm going to explain why that happened too. So first, let's talk about Cape North. Cape North, essentially what's happening there is, see all those green squares up there along the waterfront? What's happening there is before 1975, all those roads were sewered, and it just went into the ocean, right? That's what you did. That was the plan. And so that sewer system more or less existed in 1972 when the Clean Water Act was passed, but there wasn't any treatment going on. It was just being conveyed to the ocean. So once it was decided, why don't we do something about that? It was pretty easy to envision, well, if we just put lift stations all along the waterfront and push that water back toward the treatment plant that was being constructed in South Portland, we're all set. So it wasn't very controversial. It wasn't as expensive, by the way, as Cape South would be. So it passed pretty quickly. Everyone agreed it was a good idea. And so all those areas in green go to the treatment plant in South Portland, which sounds very simple, like no big deal, right? Well, it's not always that simple, because those lift stations all along the waterfront there, they're close to the ocean. And what do you think happens when, like, we get a big storm? They flood sometimes. And so it's not as simple as it sounds. Like in concept, it's simple. In the normal conditions, it's simple, but we do have some challenges with those lift stations. But what they're doing is they're pushing the water back up to Shore Road, and it's all heading. See, I never knew this until I prepared for this. Those streets all along from like the Cookie Jar all the way down to Portland Head, like that's all the wastewater is being pushed up to Shore Road, along Shore Road to the Little John pump station, from where it goes all the way around the block. It kind of goes up like this and around, and then goes to the South Portland treatment plant. I never knew this, but that's the way the water flows. And then this wastewater flows down here, and that it all goes there. That's how Cape North works. And again, it was talked about first in 72, and by 75, it was happening. So what happened to poor Cape South? Why did it take so long? Oh, by the way, I told you that sometimes it's not as simple as it sounds to keep these lift stations operating when you're so close to the ocean. This is on Garden Circle. This is what their pump station or their lift station looks like, a wet well here and some controls there. And this is what it looked like in January of this year. And this is happening more often, by the way. So we're seeing more and more of these storms that are flooding areas that we identified as a good place, a low point to get all the wastewater down to here, so then we can pump it where it needs to go. This is going to be an ongoing challenge in the coming years, I'm sure, not just for us. So I'm going to tell you the Cape South story, and then I'm done. So Cape South story. Okay, how many of you have been following the school story? Okay, everyone's chuckling. It's really the same story. And by the way, we chuckle about it, but what it is the confluence of money, what's best and what's feasible, and finding the solution that is acceptable to everybody. That's what we should do. That's what communities do. So when it was decided, when it was seen that we really need to do something about treating the wastewater in Cape South, there wasn't as much of it sewered as there is now. There was mostly septic systems, but there were like 3 small treatment facilities. One was at Spurwink, and it discharged into that estuary at Spurwink. There was another one over in this area, and then there was one down around Crescent Beach State Park. But they didn't work very well. They weren't well designed. They were just rudimentary, and it was very clear there was water quality problems. If you measure, and we have reports showing what the water quality was like. So the town manager, the district general manager, an engineering firm, were all got together and said, let's propose what we could do here. And so it was proposed. I found this, and as you know, it's now treated at Spurwink. That's where it ended up. The treatment plant was built on Spurwink. and it discharges all the way out there, which is a little bit odd. You know, so why is the plant way up there and the outfall is way down there? And also, why did it take 12 years? Because it opened in 87, 12 years after Cape North was done. So here's the story. It started like this. Doesn't this look familiar? Can't you just picture that, you know, again, a public meeting. It was the district, the town manager, an engineer to say, all right, residents, here are the options and here's how much they'll cost. And I have this transcript I found a few weeks ago upstairs in the attic. It's like 60 pages long. Someone typed out everything that was said at this meeting. And essentially what it came down to is people said, there was like 3 objections to the plan. Oh, by the way, let me show you what the plan was. The original plan, that's what the report, the cover looks like. But what it proposed was what was called the Eastfield plan. You know where Eastfield Road is? The water district has a piece of property there, and it was like, here's a logical place to build a wastewater treatment plant. We'll put it here, we'll sewer all these areas down to this plant, we'll treat the water here, and then we'll discharge it into Peebles Cove. It didn't go over well. That was where it was going to be. So maybe you know the neighborhood, there's Eastfield Road, there's Peebles Cove. That was what was proposed for a treatment facility. If you read through the transcript, there was essentially 3 objections. One was, what's wrong with our septic systems that we have? They seem to be working okay. You can't really see a failing septic system as long as the water is going underground. So it was sort of like, we're happy with the way it is. It's too expensive. And on one of the objections was also, it'll be ugly. I don't want this ugly sewage treatment plant on my road. And also, if we do this, if we sewer this area, more people will move here. You know, there'll be more houses. So again, you can just hear, and I think I can hear like some of my own thoughts about the proposal for a new school and other things like kind of expensive, you know, so everyone, the community has to decide what will we accept? Well, anyway, they didn't accept this proposal. We didn't. So now I'm just going to show you a whole bunch of headlines that were in the paper from 1978 when this was proposed until 87 when the plant on Spurwink opened. Just see if this doesn't remind you of the school proposal. So by now we're at 1984. So this is 6 years later, and there's a new proposal, and it's the Spurwink proposal. How about if we build the plant here and we sewer these areas, but not those areas? So it was like a compromise, which is exactly how communities are supposed to work, by the way, in my opinion. And eventually there was a vote, and the vote was affirmative. And the people who were most vocal in opposing it kind of said, okay, everyone, the community now seems to want this. I withdraw my objection. And the final vote was 1,225 to 790. Let's build the plant at Spurwink and do this plan. So, I mean, it's sort of a little bit gnarly. This is like, how many years is that? 1978 to 1987, so 9 years. But the solution makes some sense. Like, yes, it's kind of odd to sewer everything uphill and treat it up here and discharge it there. But if you think of where the Spurwink plant is, there's nobody living really close to that. It's kind of community land around it. That's kind of a good solution, I think, rather than having a treatment plant right on your street. Who really wants that? So anyway, it was just, I never knew any of this history, and I haven't found anyone at the company that does either. This was like, all this stuff happens. This is how communities are supposed to work. So once it was voted and everyone agreed, then we started building it. This is a picture of the plant under construction. These are called oxidation ditches, which is a form of aeration. And there it is, brand new. We were all young once. That was what our plant looked like when it first opened. And the open house was the next summer. And we've been treating wastewater there ever since. And now the plant has worked well. So that is the end of my wastewater part of the talk. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
The aerator, where you pump air into the stuff when the bugs come in and eat the stuff. Eventually the bugs get filled. What happens to them?
Well, then you generate what's called sludge. Biosolids is a happier term for it, but it's, you know, if you encourage bacteria to consume organic waste in a big swimming pool, which is what you do, then the bacteria are going to multiply. They're going to convert human waste into biomass or new bug bodies, right? So you're gonna have more bacteria, and then they're gonna accumulate, and then you have to draw them out. And, you know, you can't have to keep removing them. And so the Cape sludge, it's called sludge or biosolids, gets trucked to the East End plant where it gets dewatered there. And then you have dry, you know, because it's really wet. It's almost all water. So then you dry it and then you truck it off. Now, we used to truck it off and spread it on farm fields. That's not popular anymore. So now it's going to landfill. And that has its own challenges. We're gonna run out of landfill space. That's a challenge that all of us as community members are gonna have to wrestle with in the coming years. But for many years, it was spread, and that was the industry standard, is this is a soil amendment, it has nutrients in it. But since then, there are health concerns, PFAS type concerns that have been identified, and so that's not very popular anymore. We don't do that anymore. Now we landfill.
I'm on Fenway, Fowler. We still have septic. When can we get sewer?
So I love this question too, because what I will say to you is, the way it works is every year the water district comes to each community, because we're providing a service to Cape Elizabeth, and we say, what do you want? You know, do you want us to just do what we did last year? If so, here's an estimate of how much that will cost. This is what the sewer rates will need to be to pay that, because we can't make a profit, but we also can't have a deficit. So this is what it will cost, and that's how our sewer bills are calculated. If we said, we want more areas sewered, we would propose that, and the district's kind of legally obligated to provide if feasible, whatever the community wants, and then the community has to pay. Like, that's how it works. So we are you, like it's us. If we want more areas in Cape sewered, which would be better for the environment, but would cost money, we have to decide that's what we want, and then we have to agree to pay for it. Peebles Cove.
People.
Yeah. And then, you know, I don't know how far out the outfall is, but it's a distance enough that you can swim in People's Cove, and there's no water quality issues there, because the water has been treated, disinfected, and then you disinfect, and then you remove the disinfectant, and then you discharge it to the ocean.
On Spurwink, I think there's a pump up station.
Right, that station that when you're coming sort of from Scott Dyer Road, there's the station on the right, that's a lift station, and then on the left is the treatment.
And there's a discharge pipe there that goes into the.
No, nothing discharges into the estuary. It pushes it up to the treatment plant and then down to People's Cove. It used to discharge to the estuary, but that was the project, was to eliminate that, because that was the
Because I live
estuary was
close by to
contaminated.
that, and I smell that plant every once in a while.
Well, you know, I'm sorry about that, but I often say we're not a generating facility, we're a receiving facility, so really that's us. I mean, let's just say that's.
I was in Broad Cove for a while, and there's a pipe that went out like right into Broad Cove, in the ocean there. And was that an intake or an outtake?
There's not an intake, that was an outfall. There are no combined, as I mentioned, in Portland, it's a combined sewer system, and in old communities, that's often what it was, is that you conveyed wastewater from the streets and from the homes in the same pipes. And that's where you get the combined sewer overflow, because when it rains, it overwhelms those systems, and then they discharge directly into Casco Bay. Cape doesn't have any more of those are gone. Because our system isn't with the stormwater off the streets doesn't go into the sewer system, it just runs off the streets. Which, by the way, can be also not the greatest of water quality, but it doesn't have any isn't sanitary wastewater the weirdest term? Like, it's the most unsanitary thing you can think of, but we call it sanitary wastewater.
You read a lot about putting things into the sewer that are, like flushable wipes that are artificial, compostable materials. Nationally hear about this. Is that a big problem?
It is a problem. They want, what happens is, even when they call them flushable, yeah, they'll go down your toilet. But what happens is, even when they say, oh, they dissolve, they break up, they kind of are fibrous. And so then they'll come into the plant and they wind around the pumps and they clog everything up. And then we have to take the pump apart and clear that off and then put it back together. So please, only toilet paper and everything else in the trash. We're paying for that. Like, when we have to do that, it's reflected in our rates, and they do not do what the manufacturers say. It's really best not to flush them down.
Is it going to be regulated up? stream and.
I think that at this point in the process, and this is also, again, I've been in environmental regulation a long time, you always start with, let's just provide information and as a technical assistance model and see if that works. And often that does. And so if that can work, that's better than regulations, which cost money and other things. So at this point, it's not a law, but I think some states are starting to think about bans and things. Of course, a ban doesn't really regulate much of what you do in your own home, which is why, again, the technical assistance model, like this is our sewer system. We bought it and we operate it and we pay for anything that has to be done to it. So let's take care of it. I think that's a better model, at least to start.
I just have a closer for you. So I've traveled in Europe, Greece recently, and South Asia, and I really appreciate what you do with the waste things, because yeah, we have those little buckets where you put your toilet paper and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
It's very nice that we can handle that.
I love that you're all here and that you care this much, because again, these are, you know, I would say that if I were back in 1905, 1906, I agree that water and wastewater treatment should be a community thing, a nonprofit thing that we do together. I'm not saying the for-profit model can't work, but I really think it's the best. It's the model that makes the most sense to me because we can't live without water and we really can't live without wastewater treatment either. We would be living in pollution. So let's just get together and agree on the best way to do it. I really think it's working well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nobody said that we have the best tasting water anywhere, but we do. And I'm so grateful.
I agree. I drink it all the time.
Anyway.
We really need sewer nerds on the board. It just is. I will say this, that I've been working with the board for 25 years. I actually think its great strength is the mix of, like, there are some who are, we get engineers there that know a lot. We get people who know a lot about other fields. And sometimes at the beginning, I'm like, wait, now I have to explain this, and it's very basic. Just like if I was on an insurance board, you'd have to bring me all the way down to the basics. Sometimes that's how the best decisions are made. It's like force the experts to boil it down to what's actually going on. And so I've learned to really love the way the board deliberates on things, and we've made much better decisions because we have lay people guiding us.
Yeah. Wow.
They do listen, they know I know the engineers know a lot, but they don't know everything. And sometimes it's like the confluence of politics and public interest and engineering. And engineers can't always see that.
Yeah.
That's why I love the board.
That's so cool. Well,
I'd
it
love
definitely
to have
put
you
my
on the board.
tours. People were so generous with their time and answering questions. So
It's
informative.
kind of a calling. It
Really
really is.
awesome.